Morning, everybody. Just a little interlude here between the Hollywood series. You'll see the rest of that later in this episode. But I put on this great Teddy Charles record this morning. And Teddy's a vibraphonist from the 40s and 50s, 60s. Great player, has a lot of records on a lot of different labels. His work at Atlantic's fantastic. I've always been a big Teddy Charles fan. He's a creative guy. Great composer, great arranger, which a lot of the pianists and vibraphonists tend to be. But I put this on. I've listened to it quite a bit, but something just kind of clicked this morning. Shorty Rogers, Jimmy Joffrey, Charlie Mingus, and Shelly Manne playing with him here, which is a pretty amazing group. And it was like, man, those Savoy jazz workshops seemed like they were kind of similar lineups when my mind kind of jogged to it. This, of course, is an OJC pressing. Oh no, it's not an original. I must not be able to hear the music. But these are the two jazz workshop LPs at Savoy. And I think they're probably all from 10-inch era stuff, if I think about it. Probably 54. And there's different lineups on each side of these. I think there's different lineups on this one as well. Is there? Or is this all one lineup? No, it's two different lineups for sure. So yeah, it's all probably called from probably 53, 54 sessions. So this jazz workshop group, I mean, there's some great talent on these records. On this one came first, 12045, and it's kind of confusing because when I first got this from Wikipedia years ago, the printout for the Savoy catalog, they had this Mingus. This one has Mingus on it, listed as 12045, and 12059 was blank, and they were uncertain of what it was. So that's the thing with Wikipedia; it's kind of an evolving beast. So they actually had these two wrong in the catalog. I think it's been fixed since then, if I remember. But so you got Shorty Rogers, Jimmy Joffrey, Shelly Manne, as well as Joe Mandergan, Frank Patchen, Bob Gordon, Conte Condoli, Art Pepper, so some great West Coast talent. Bill Russo, who's one of the great arrangers, worked I think with Woody Herman for a while, maybe Stan Kenton actually, possibly both. I mean, those two had a lot of crossover, it seems like, between their great orchestras. But it's like a Bill Russo arranger. He's a really interesting guy, Russo. He's not just straight charts. It's like there's a lot of Ellington and composition going on. And this one has Mingus on the bass with John Laporta, a great talent who's kind of really underappreciated. Teo Macero, who's also kind of a very known for his production with Miles Davis. Here he's playing the sax, still as a musician. George Barrow on the baritone sax, Mal Waldron on the piano, a great New York piano player. And Rudy Nichols on the drums, a name I'm not too familiar with. Side 2 has Wally Cirillo, Teo Macero, Charlie Mingus, and Kenny Clark. So again, these musicians here in these jazz workshop sessions, pretty talented stuff. And then this Evolution record on Prestige, which I think comes from the same time frame, has pretty much the same conglomeration, 53, 55. So yeah, it's fun stuff. Big fan of Teddy Charles. Big fan of these records. The one with Mingus as front and center, kind of. This one goes for better money than the one with just Bill Russo and Shelly Manne on the cover. Which, I mean, it's a little silly. Yeah, I mean, they're both fantastic records. Both stupid screen. Both modern and interesting stuff. Interesting in a post-bop sense. Because after the bebop era, jazz starts reverting back to more of a compositional and arranged structure in some of these recordings. It was less about just the velocity of bebop and the fierce direction and intensity of bebop. It goes back to more, I mean, Jerry Mulligan and Birth of the Cool is a big part of that. And with Miles Davis and that whole crew. And you get this whole movement of sounds, including the Modern Jazz Quartet, and obviously some of the stuff I'm showing you here, that was compositional, smaller group than the Ellington stuff. Wasn't 18-piece bands, it was 5, 6, 7-piece bands. Doing interesting compositional, moody soundscape. Some of it kind of evolves and becomes the third stream. Some of it is actually a precursor to the avant-garde at times. You have guys like Mingus, who became big parts of the avant-garde. steering this direction at this time, a lot of what's happening. And the other side of that coin was the cool bop, hard bop coin. So when those guys were playing that fierce up-tempo, bright hard bop, and the West Coast kids were playing the cool bop, this was the more laid-back, somewhat orchestral, interesting instrumentation. Let's add a tuba and a French horn. How about a bass clarinet? I got a Jimmy Joffrey is very much at the forefront of a lot of this stuff as well, in terms of the composition and the driving sounds and the interesting soundscapes that become more divergent than simply playing the American songbook or playing the blues, the gospel, or playing bebop, up-tempo. This was much more melancholic and pastel and much more mid-tempo to down-tempo. So it's fun stuff, very complex, very interesting. Monk, of course, is a progenitor of all this to some degree because of his innovations in the 40s. Just, I mean, the minimalism and the abstract nature of some of his chords and sounds and blocks and rhythms and pulsing. Monk says, yeah, all this stuff can be done. You're going to need to invent some new symbols, Mr. Music by Numbers, to capture some of my rests, my pauses, my stutters, my stops, my blocks, my chops. Monk puts a new vocabulary into the writer's songbook. Monk says you can do weird things. You can make angles and cuts and blocks and zigzags. And musically, if you're a musician, you understand what I'm saying. And so much of what becomes alternative, including guys like Frank Zappa. I mean, the alternative, the interesting, the divergent, the dissonant, the resolving dissonance, a lot of that stuff stems back to Monk in so many ways. And it's not to say guys like Ellington didn't delve into it before him. You know, Ellington has moments of dissonance. Ellington has, obviously, the greatest compositions ever. But Monk did add a new layer, a new dimension, a new fingertip extension to the monster. Monk says, you can do some weird things with these fingers. Which was pretty cool. Which was, you know, I mean, Monk's so interesting. And I think Monk's legacy at times is kind of subliminal and underappreciated. But it's also sometimes bigger than him in a way. I mean, his songs were omnipresent. His approach impacted so many. And so I think the legacy of Monk, it's less visible and tangible to people, but it's really omnipresent once you kind of understand what he brought to the table and how he said, let's open up that Pandora's box and make so many more things a part of the lexicon. So that's it for today. Just some cool, I mean, my mind has a lot of time in this room right now, which is cool because it's allowing me to make connections like these. Like, oh, you know what? That's a pretty similar lineup. And I'll bet you there's a few more sessions from some of these artists that were kind of from the same conglomerate. I bet you if I looked at some of Jimmy Joffrey's records, some of Shelly Mann's stuff, you're going to see some crossover here between a lot of these guys. Some of Mingus's work, probably even Shorty Rogers' work. I mean, these were the musicians of the time in the scene. So fantastic stuff. And then we're going to jump back into the Hollywood series piece. Hey guys, welcome to part 2 on the Hollywood film industry record labels. And it's an interesting thing how big of an impact ABC via in Impulse. And of course, MGM with the Metro Jazz series. I mean, that was a really good series of 15 records that MGM puts out. Pretty high quality stuff there. But, and we'll show you that probably in a separate episode. But again, the film industry wasn't so much changing the course of jazz. I mean, they did have quite a bit of jazz showing up in film, and they started using it more actually in soundtracks. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, jazz would show up as a Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington or Count Basie. They'd show up in a film and they'd play. But jazz started becoming more of the scoring, of the background, of the setting, the mood pieces of films in the 50s and 60s. And that was an interesting change in jazz. And I think it's also part of what helped drive some of the avant-garde, some of the experimental composition, because you're using music to create mood, to create a feeling, a sensation. And so that's all kind of happening simultaneously. And certain people in the jazz scene end up spending a career in television and film. So that wasn't a very big leap. And guys like Neil Hefti and Henry Mancini were kind of bridging that gap anyway between jazz and film soundtrack and orchestral score. So jazz was this interesting crossroads here. And in some ways, film helps buoy jazz and keeps it more a part of the lexicon than it probably would have standing on the legs of bebop alone. Because bebop definitely was a fractured, splintered isolation cell that didn't really appeal to the masses. And the swing bands were definitely falling out of favor. Rhythm and blues, jump blues were starting to come into the norm. The Louis Jordans were ruling the R&B charts. The Tiny Bradshaws. It was a changing time. Ray Charles is showing up in the late 40s. You know what I mean? Soul music, Sam Cooke, gospel, it's all kind of melding into this new rhythm and blues sound that jazz reflects in soul jazz in the 60s. So it was an interesting time. MGM is probably the first one on the scene. Then we talked about, I'm drawing a blank here. ABC Impulse. Sorry, just a little mind. It's kind of early. And so the other there was 5 big studios in this point of time. And one of the other ones was 20th Century Fox. And Fox doesn't really dive into jazz as far as I know. When they came into being, I'm not exactly sure. I didn't look it up. I know I don't think I have any 20th Century Fox jazz records in my collection that I can think of. Unless it was under a subsidiary label, perhaps. But I don't think they show up into probably the 60s sometime in terms of putting music out. And like I said, by the disco era, there's a lot of stuff on 20th Century Fox that's very disco and R&B and popular, and that fit what they were doing. Of course, all these film industry record labels were created with the intent of distributing film soundtracks. That was a big part of what they were undertaking. It's like we could put out our own film soundtracks, and the nature of film soundtracks was starting to change. You were writing more original pieces for soundtracks, which opens the door for guys like Oliver Nelson and Quincy Jones to come along and really change the landscape. Buddy Collette. These guys were big influences on the sound of film. And film is probably the way where jazz has most stayed connected to the American public. We don't listen to it much on our radios, in our cars, or at home. But jazz shows up in certain scenes to create a mood, to create a tempo, to create a vibe, to create an era. And most of us know jazz mostly from that context. That's where it's familiar to us. And I think some people aren't even cognizant of that connection. But they hear jazz in here, and it's strangely not that foreign, even though they know nothing about jazz, which many people have admitted they know nothing about jazz in here. And yet, it's comfortable. Yet it's not obtuse. It's warm and embracing. Part of that's knowing how to play the right jazz at the right time. I'm playing stuff that's supposed to make people feel warm and invited and comfortable and enticing. And I think that's, again, one of the things that jazz ambassadors often lack is that sympathy for the listener to think of where they're at in their musical journey. And maybe something super complex is not going to draw them in. And you can be complex and still be accessible. I mean, Duke Ellington, who was the architect of all that, he was often very complex with his counter melodies and counter rhythms, and the things he was doing were often very sophisticated. But it always stayed with some tension and resolve. It always had a melodic center. It always recognized the roots for the most part. And it was always just grooving. It had that spiritual, sexual pulse to it that was just undeniable. So like I said, 20th Century Fox doesn't really get into the mix here. And if they do, I don't know where. And maybe they show up in the jazz in the 60s and the 70s. I don't think I have anything jazz related on that label. There might be something over my Fusion 70s shelves, 60s shelves. I go through those shelves a ton, if I'm honest. You know, I pull up my favorite records from there, Donald Byrds and George Benson stuff, and play that once in a while, DJ it. But I don't spend a lot of time going through my Hubert Laws. You know what I mean? Most of the time I put on a CTI. I mean, unless it's one of the really great titles, most of it's kind of like, I'm not in the mood for Hubert Laws right now. It's too new agey. I mean, it's really well made, and the covers are beautiful. And once in a while, that's the perfect backscape to what I'm doing. I mean, I'm in a Star Trek mood. I'm on a weird planet with green people. Some CTI Hubert Laws might be perfect for me at that point, with the abstract shapes on the covers. And, I mean, they're beautiful artwork, no question about it. So, that being said, that leaves 2 other big film studios. There was one called RKO, too, which I don't really know much about that either. I don't think I know any RKO jazz records. There was a TKO, I think it was disco label as well. But there was Warner Brothers, which we'll talk about briefly, and then there was United Artists. And Warner Brothers seems to kind of show up a little bit later once again. Probably late 58, 59. You get stuff like Swingin' Buddy Cole with a great album cover. That's more Buddy Cole. He's an organ guy. Siesta on Miles Davis, but that's much, much later. More Miles. A Mandala. Again, that's 80s Miles, 80s Miles. These aren't in chronological order. Pete and Conti Candoli, Warner Brothers 1462. That's a pretty early one right there. Paul Desmond. That's the perfect kind of fare for a Warner Brother label. You can see Warner Brothers Film Studio on the back of the paper sleeve. So that looks like that was on the back of a lot of their paper sleeves. Marty Peisch has a couple of great records here on Warner Brothers. What comes to mind for me mostly is some of the Chico Hamilton stuff. There's another Marty Peisch, more of the Warner Brothers Film Studios. Hancock has a couple records with the Mwandishi Band in the early 70s right here. Got Albert Rotunda. Kenny Gill, that's 70s stuff. Clockwork Orange, again, soundtrack. There's some early Chico Hamilton. I think it's from like 58, 1245. So it's not a big jazz imprint from Warner Brothers. Some Charlie Parker stuff. I'm not sure how that ends up there. Gongs East, 1271. So that's pretty early again, probably 58, 59. Chico makes a lot of records. The Three Faces of Chico, 1344. So that's probably 60, 61 right there. And then they signed Antonio Carlos Jobim, which obviously this is probably at the height of the Bossa Nova. And it's probably a great signing if you think about it, because there's some Petula Clark downtown. I found that somewhere. It's more of a pop record, but all the same. I'll leave that out. And so that is honestly it for my Warner Brothers Jazz. Some good titles, 58, 59, and in the 60s, and even in the 70s, they're still doing great jazz. And like I said, they signed Miles away from Columbia in the 80s, which was supposed to be a big coup for them. But Miles wasn't the artist that he once was. He wasn't attracting the audience he once did. I bet you that they offered him a third of what Columbia was paying him, but Columbia probably wasn't even going to give him that, because I think Columbia was pretty upset with a lot of what Miles' choices had been in the 70s, even in the 60s. The success of Sketches of Spain and Kinda Blue, there's a lot more misses and a lot more out to left field records in terms of commercial appeal. And again, Miles was always a guy that I felt like was driven very much by his insecurities and his animosity. And it feels like Miles never really fit in anywhere. The black community all saw him as a bit bougie and middle class and upper middle class. And he carried himself like he was better than people from what I've read, and how he just was kind of aloof and almost snobbish, which kind of pushed him away from his own community. But the white community embraced him only to a point. Because, I might buy your records, but I'm not going to let you date my daughter. After all, you're a black man in America in the 50s and 60s. And so he was never really a part of... Never feel like he was ever really embraced by a community in a personal sense. So I think he always had an edge and an animosity and a fuck you white boy attitude when, buy my record, white boy. Don't talk to me. Just buy my record. I want to make some money. I got some mouths to feed. And that's white girls I'm going to take out on a date tonight. That's the mouths I'm going to feed. He had that kind of edginess to him, his flamboyance. And he even does the record to Jack Johnson, the great heavyweight fighter, who embodied a lot of that personality. But he could back that up in the turn of the century. Miles Davis in the 60s, again, he was a small guy, driven by insecurity. And he's overcompensating. He's trying to create an aura and a persona that's much tougher and stronger and bigger than he is. Prince, I think, has some of that same element. Prince often had girls in his band, not because they were talented, which they often really were, like Sheila E., but they were more his size. When he played with men, his 4'8" or 4'11" stature, 5'1", whatever it is. He's a little guy, Prince. I mean, he often wears high heel boots, 4-inch heels, and he's still shorter than all the dudes in the band. I've seen the motorcycle he drives in Purple Rain personally out at Paisley Park Studios. And that's a little moped. That's a little bike, man. It's probably a 250 little Honda, whatever that. I can't remember what it was years ago when I saw it. I was like, that thing's cute. It's like a replica of the real. I'm like, no, that's the real motorcycle. I mean, it probably doesn't hit 50 miles an hour. That thing was little. And, little guys have to act bigger somehow. They have to compensate for their diminutive size. And Miles certainly has a lot of that, I feel, at times. And, I mean, he didn't face his audience quite often. He didn't want to look at them. You know what I mean? And that's somewhat insecurity coupled with the contempt. And contempt is a tough load to carry. It's a lot of weight. So moving on, we're going to talk about United Artists now. And United Artists was a great label. They jumped on the fray probably 56, 57, I would say. So probably ran the heels of ABC. And they do equal to ABC in terms of quality and great releases. Then they also released a special release of jazz records, which I just completed, which I'm looking forward to showing you. So we're going to look at some United Artists stuff here. And you get stuff like, Midnight Cowboy and, the Bong themes, which those come later. They're not early United Artists. So when you get into earlier, there's a 3000 sequence. And the 3000 sequence is pretty much pop. Vocal pop, bluesy pop. This record, the Ivory Hunters double barrel piano with Bob Brookmeyer and Bill Evans, was initially in the 3000 sequence, but I think it also had a 6000 sequence, it's kind of confusing how United Artists runs their sequences. The main jazz sequence is the 4000 mono, 5000 stereo. And I think the 6000 is the stereo version of the 3000 mono. That's why those numbers are both on there. But the 3000 sequence, you want those less than you want the 4,000 or 5000 series stuff, which is some pretty great stuff. Diane Carroll, she's got some stuff here. That was 3000. Probably the coolest record in that sequence is this big tiny guitar, is it? Big time guitar from Tiny Grimes. A great bluesy R&B soul piano player. Big fan of Tiny. Al Kayola, who has to work on Savoy. His work at United Artists is much more mainstream. Art Farmer, 4007. That was a big signing for them. Bob Brookmeyer, he shows up here with some great stuff. Randy Weston, the great New York piano player. Benny Carter, Aspects. These are great titles by a great label. There's some more Randy Weston. Let's go keep them in sequence here. So 4020, that's Benny Golson and the Philadelphians. Lee Morgan, Philly Joe, Percy Heath, and Ray Bryant. Great stuff. There's some fantastic Milt Jackson. Bags, the great Detroit vibraphonist, Bags Opus. Playing here with Benny Golson, Art Farmer, Connie Kay, Tommy Flanagan, and Paul Chambers. So, I mean, they're bringing in heavy hitters here. This isn't some lukewarm jazz. 5023, 4023, whichever you want to call it. This is a stereo. Has Zut Sims, Al Cohen, Bob Brookmeyer, Harry Edison. That's Sweets. Nat Pearson, Freddie Green. So you got some Count Basie alumni there with Pierce, Edison, and Green. And then some of the top leading white cats on the top there was Sims, Cohen, and Brookmeyer. Great cover. I'm sure a lot of people today are too woke to appreciate the beauty of a woman. I think it's just nonsense. Motor City Scene. This is a Detroit grouping here with Billy Mitchell, the great Thad Jones, brother of Elvin and Hank, Al Gray, the fantastic trombonist, Tommy Flanagan, Paul Chambers, and his brother Elvin Jones. That's a pretty expensive record, pretty tough to come by nowadays. One I used to see more often, but Booker Little, the guy who replaced Clifford Brown with Max Roach, one of the great trumpet players of this era, who only makes 4 records as a leader and a half dozen sections as a sideman. He's out of Memphis. He came up with all those Memphis cats up to Chicago and made a real splash, enough to replace Clifford Brown. But sadly, he died from some health issues. I don't think it was drugs. I think it was a health issue with him. Charlie Mingus Jazz Portraits. This has 2 different covers. It actually gets reissued in the second sequence I'm going to show you here in a little bit. Zoot Sims, Al Cohn, and Phil Woods, Jazz Alive with the half note. Nice gatefold on that one. This is another tough record to find, Sliding Easy by Curtis Fuller with Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, Tommy Flanagan, Paul Chambers, and Elvin Jones. That's Blue Note quality stuff, probably 58, 59, with Benny Golson and Gigi Grice doing the arrangements. That's some pretty serious stuff. Herbie Mann's African Suite, great cover, wonderful sounds, cool composition. Herbie was a much more diverse player than people give him credit for. A lot of people think he's just push, and that poppy stuff of the 70s. He was much more than that. This is Randy Weston with 4 trombones. I think Melba Liston was one of the arrangers on this. Destry Rides Again. Fantastic stuff. So that's some of the cool stuff on that regular sequence. A few more titles I'm going to show you. Brass Shout, more Art Farmer. This has, I think this also has a different cover, I think, if I remember. This is Paul Kinnichet, Harry Edison, a bunch of bassy guys, like who, led by Paul Kinnichet, putting some bassy guys together. Modern Jazz Quartet 4072. This has 2 covers as well. More Paul Kinnichet with more bassy guys. We're talking 4077. So that first 100 records is a pretty solid. There's the Aztec Suite, more Art Farmer. Good stuff right there. Music composed by Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong for Paris Blues, a film soundtrack. More Benny Carter, one of the great alto sax and trumpet players. Basie meets Bond, which is a bit of a schlicky bassy session, to be honest. So that's all a precursor to what they launched in '61 with this cool series that was called, I think it's the 15,000 or 14,000 sequence. And this was originally on United Artists, led by Cecil Taylor, if I remember. I think it's the one with the car. Let me just double check that. Yeah. So that's just the repackage of that. That's what they relaunched this new jazz sequence with, 15,001, which is the same as 14,001. Art Blakey, 3 Blind Mice, Jazz Messengers, 14,002. This has Cedar Walton, Curtis Fuller, Freddie Hubbard, Wayne Shorter. A serious band right there. Number 3 is this fantastic Bill Evans and Jim Hall record. It's been reissued numerous times. Pretty tough record to find. I think Tone Point might have reissued this, because remember, Blue Note sells to Liberty, and the United Artists ends up buying Liberty. And so this becomes a pretty big jazz empire in a way, as they start buying out everybody. Danny Small, Woman She Was Born for Sorrow, 14,004. Interesting cover. I can't even remember what he even plays, honestly. I think it might be more of a folky record, but piano vocals with Zane Paul on the reeds, John Latham on the bass, Tim Kenny on the drums. I'm not sure if I've even listened to that one. It came in a package and it probably never got played. Here's the great Jerome Richardson. This is a tough record to come by. One of the most diverse talents in the jazz scene in the 60s with Jerome Richardson. Played a lot of different instruments. He's like some of those players that just shows up on so many sessions as a sideman. Who we just talked about the other day is like, his work as a leader is small, but his effort as a sideman is just incredible. And Jerome Richardson is one of those guys where he's on literally hundreds of records as a sideman. Cool cover. And he's playing, going to the movies, playing some Hollywood stuff. 14,007. This has 2 different covers. This is Kenny Dorham. Pretty serious, great stuff here. Great band. It's got Jackie McLean, Bobby Timmons, Teddy Smith, and J.C. Moses, along with Kenny Dorham. It's a record that's pretty tough to come by. Herbie Mann, Brazil, Bossa Nova, and the Blues. Again, so we're in 61, 62. The Bossa Nova is kind of ubiquitous at this point. Billy Strayhorn, the fantastic composer and Duke Ellington's left-hand man. This is one of his records, The Peaceful Side. Gorgeous stuff. Got the cigarette going in there. Cool cover. They mostly end up with these black and white covers. King Pleasure, Mr. Jazz, a guy who was one of the legends of Vocalese. And Vocalese was like kind of doing bebop solos and jazz solos with your mouth. 1413, this is a Japanese pressing. Zoot Sims in Paris. I'd like to find an original of that at some point, but that's what I have for now. Number 1414, Billie Holiday, Lady Love. A cool session. This is a concert, if I remember, from Germany. Hamburg, maybe. Somewhere in Germany that was recorded, and United Artists owned it. You're the Sheep, Ken McIntyre. A pretty tough record to come by. 14,015. Nice modern hints of the avant-garde with him. He's got some great stuff over at New Jazz as well right before this. Vi Red, Bird Call, number 15016. Fantastic alto saxophonist. She often led all-female bands, which we talked about the other day. Those were hard to maintain. Money Jungle, Duke Ellington, Charlie Mingus, and Max Roach, the trio, 1417. This is a pretty famous record from the sequence. Probably not as good as it's hyped. It's pretty overhyped, I think, but it's still a fine session, and it's cool. I mean, I'll take Ellington Coltrane over that, really, but Ellington's always wonderful to me. This is Oliver Nelson here, A Taste of Honey, and this is where he's starting to branch into films and soundtracks and composition. Impressions of Fire, more Oliver Nelson Orchestra. Again, that's a pretty big arranged, composed piece. Herbie Mann St. Thomas, 14022. And at this point in the sequence, they start omitting some numbers. Our Most Beloved Spiritual, Alice McCarthy, the Faith Temple Choir. So there's a bit of a gospel kind of soul blues inflected session right there. Charlie Mingus Town Hall Concert, 15024. And I think this was the second concert he did. I don't think it was the first one. But I know Mingus had some concerts that didn't go very well for him. 15025, Jazz Joint Happiness, Rose Murphy, featuring Slam Stewart. And you got Selden Powell, Joe Jones, Charlie Shavers, Specs Powell. Some great players are on this. And Slam Stewart does a lot of that bass playing while he's singing and accompanying himself, creating chords with his mouth. Slam's a crazy cool player. Cool stuff. Tough one to come by. This is a great record here by Howard McGee, one of the great trumpet players from the bebop era. Here he's doing something much more post-bop. Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out. Great cover. Just really captures the urbanity and just the condition of the black male in America. You just seem to feel it on that cover. Tales of Kaufman, 15029, and that's the great Mo Kaufman, who's actually from Toronto, Canada. A great alto sax player, great flute player. I think he plays clarinet some as well. His work on Jubilee is also really fantastic. And he played in the scene for a long time. And then the last one here is Bud Freeman with two guitars with George Barnes and Carl Kress. And Bud Freeman goes back to the days of the Chicago Kids, the Austin High Gang, a real great player, a real leader of the young white movement in jazz in the 30s. And a really important player. He has some work at Bethlehem as well as a leader in this later era of jazz. But he's definitely a harbinger of an earlier dime. So that's the end of that sequence, number 33. And from what I know and what I can tell, those omitted numbers weren't issued. And I could be wrong. If you have one of those records that I don't have, let me know. But I think that's everything I've found or seen. And those covers kind of stick out when you see them, when you're scrolling through someone's store. You're like, oh, that's one of those United Artists records. And so some of them I just recognize right away without even having seen them before. I'm like, oh, that's got to be from that sequence. So I think that's that whole sequence. And then it ends there, probably 64, maybe 65. But it's a fine little chunk of jazz right there. And it's not long after that where they start buying out Liberty, which had Blue Note and United Artists, and they eventually get bought out as well. I think they're part of Universal now, is it? Or, I don't know, I get that. Those later years much more confused, honestly. But a cool label, United Artists. And there's a lot of titles in there that will fetch big bucks. And they were fairly well distributed. So they're not as rare as some of the older Blue Notes or Prestige or older Riversides or Savoys. But they were rare enough that they could still fetch pretty good money. That Thad Jones record, I mean, I've seen that go for good bucks. The Curtis Fuller, good bucks. Great records with great players. Just really impressive all the way around. And so those four labels all kind of took a piece of the jazz pie away from some of the smaller labels and even from some of the bigger labels. And they all made a pretty big impact. MGM has a fairly nice, catalog. ABC Impulse is a huge part of the jazz story. United Artists obviously has a lot of flex and pull, late 50s into the early 60s. Warner Brothers, they get in the game kind of late, 58, 59, it seems like, but then they make some pretty impressive recordings with Mwandishi and Miles in the 80s. And I mean, it's a pretty impressive little run that Warner Brothers even has. And again, 20th Century Fox doesn't seem to really get into the mix in the same way. So that's kind of wrapping up this series on those great Hollywood film industry music labels that all felt the need to have jazz as part of their catalog. Jazz was important enough. It was Americana. It was interesting music made by great musicians. And again, jazz was heading down big time in terms of its sales and popularity. So these film companies all kind of entered the game towards the end of the run. You know, and there's a reason why some of those labels, those little sequences like Metro Jazz from MGM and that little run there from United Artists, there's a reason why those sequences didn't go on much past 15 or 27 titles, whatever that one is. The commercial viability just wasn't there. And like I said, they were taking stuff from their regular sequence that has already been issued with the Mingus, with the Coltrane, and repackaging it. You know, something that Bob Weinstock or Herman Lubinsky at Savoy had been doing for decades. You know, I mean, that was already old hat to those guys. But so there is some little tricks of the trade there when you can buy that stuff twice pretty quickly. But I mean, if you can find the old hard driving jazz with the car on the cover, that's a record worth having. So I appreciate you all. If you want to subscribe to the channel, hit that thumbs up. It all helps with the algorithms and getting this message out there. Again, we're a channel that talks about the music and the history of the music and its place in the American story. And that's what we always want this channel to be about, is the interesting stories. You know, we don't want to talk about some of the minutia of pressings and money and, I mean, what studio this was printed at, who pressed it. I mean, that stuff has its place, but if you're in a Tom Sawyer book club, you got to talk about that river. You need to talk about that story. The binding and the ink and the paper has its place, and it's always nice to have an old pressing of a book or an old pressing of a record, but there's sure a lot more to the story than just saying, I have an old record I spent $200 on. What does it make you feel? What about, where was this guy coming from? Where was he at in his career? And I try to offer some of that insight, some of that comparative information, because I have all the labels nearly completed, you know, so many of them, that there's a lot of cross-referencing in my mind all the time when I'm doing this stuff. I know what's happening everywhere else simultaneously. So it does allow me to kind of make little references and jumps and leaps and references that are valid because I've connected the dots chronologically with all these labels. So I think it's interesting stuff. I hope you all enjoy that. We'll get back to some other cool content coming up real soon. Y'all have a great weekend. By the time you see this, it's probably going to be Monday anyway. Y'all be safe. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.